Okay, so this is a slightly different talk than the one that I was on, that you had the title for, because that's a talk I'm giving actually in Tokyo on Friday. But there's some similar stuff. So I'm going to talk about progress report on AI for science, kind of where we're headed, and some interesting examples kind of along the way. So many of you are aware that in 2019 and 2022, DOE Labs, with support from DOE headquarters, ran a series of very large workshops with over 1,300 people to ask the question, what grand challenges in science would AI be imperative to accomplish? And we did that in the summer of 19 at meetings at Argonne and Oak Ridge and Berkeley Lab and in Washington. And then of course, there was the pandemic, and over 3 years, there was a huge amount of progress in AI, right? Language models kind of broke out with ChatGPT, Midjourney and DALL-E and so forth, or images. AlphaFold folded a number of proteins, et cetera, et cetera. And so by the spring of 22, it was pretty clear that the assumptions that we had made about the landscape going forward from 19 really had to be updated. And so we organized, along with our NNSA lab partners, a new set of workshops that focused on AI for science, energy, and national security. But we organized those very differently. We organized the second series of meetings around 6 big themes of AI, different themes, 6 different ways in which AI can be applied to science, and not just in narrow domains, but in very cross-cutting areas. And I'm not going to go through all 6 of these because we don't have time, but I'm going to touch on a number of them. But AI for predicting advanced properties of things and doing inverse design, whether that's in molecules or proteins or materials or other things like that. AI and robotics for autonomous discovery, where we link robots with AI to make progress, particularly in benchtop science. AI for high-performance computing surrogates, so injecting AI as kernel replacements and applications to accelerate them and so on. AI for software engineering and programming. AI for control of complex systems like reactors and cities and so forth, and then foundation models. And I'm going to walk through a number of these quickly. I'm going to spend more of my time on the foundation model piece. We actually did another meeting back in December, recently, and just for fun, I had GPT-4 actually take the topics that we had used for the summer workshops and said, if you were enhancing those for topics for a workshop that was focused on energy, how might you do it? And actually, it did a pretty good job. You can see that it added to each one something that had to do with a linkage to energy, and then it added a 7th area, which we didn't have, which was AI for geospatial and renewable energy siting decisions, like where you're going to build big solar plants or new transmission lines or something like that, which is a big deal for DOE. So it was quite interesting that ChatGPT-4 was able to understand kind of the context for this meeting, for these workshops, and weave in energy topics and basic research energy in a way that was non-trivial. If you read through these reports and tried to pull out examples, you would get a list like this, right? One thing we're interested in is using AI to design proteins, not evolve proteins, but design proteins for function, whether it's for biocatalysis, maybe for carbon dioxide capture, or for other purposes, to improve climate models, or to design new quantum materials, or control fusion reactors, moving codes from existing computers to special purpose accelerators, or accelerators without human intervention. This is a huge deal for us, since we have hundreds of millions of lines of code in DOE, and so on. So you can see that there's a wide range of topics, in fact, dozens and dozens of topics where AI is going to affect science. Now, one of the, I see there's a slide doesn't want to stay there, okay. I'll leave that alone. All right, so let me talk a little bit about advanced property prediction and inverse design. So the basic idea here is that you want to build a model from some data sets or current knowledge that we have about materials or proteins or phenotypes of an organism or something, and have a very good forward model. That's a prerequisite typically for this. And do this in a way that you can associate with thousands or millions of examples in the forward model properties that you're interested in, and then use some technique, some generative technique, could be stable diffusion, could be transformer-based models, to basically generate new examples where you're optimizing for those properties that you care about. And this has been successfully applied to many problems in molecular design, drug design, and so forth. And this is an area that is kind of a holy grail, like a special direction for a lot of science problems, because you can frame many science problems as searching for an optimized material or a new drug. So this is an example actually from some Japanese group a few years ago that wasn't using a generative model in the way I'm talking about, but it was a multitask model that was trained to predict over 40 properties in a single model around materials. And it kind of changed people's attitude about what a single model was able to do. Recently, as in a couple months ago, there was a release of there's a paper here, but a system called MatterGen. So it's a generative model for materials from Microsoft's AI for Science effort. And what's interesting about this is it uses stable diffusion, and it essentially takes a stable material, does a forward model that's adding more and more noise to the point where the structure has been randomized, and then runs a stable diffusion model now, but with the objective goal to have a new material that's different from the original one. And they've been able to use this to design thousands of new stable materials, and it has, I don't have more slides on it here, but I encourage you to read this paper. It's a pretty interesting approach. So it's a generative model for inorganic materials design. Probably in somewhat of a competitive situation to that group, which is based in the US, there's another group that's actually in the Microsoft research office in Beijing who's built the world's largest molecular foundation model for designing materials. This is a MFM. It's a 22 billion parameter model that is called a distributional graph former model. So what this model does, it kind of, its high-level goal is to not just predict a single instance of a target problem, so a single drug or a single protein structure, but to actually predict the distribution of structures for a given set of inputs. And it's been used for drug design, for biological understanding, molecular dynamics, so it's clearly a foundation model. It's been trained on a wide variety of problems. What's interesting about this is they haven't released it yet. They're intending to make actually a product out of it. So on the AI for robotics and autonomous discovery line, the basic idea here, right, is combining AI and robotics to create self-driving labs. This is a term that's been used to describe these kinds of systems. And at Argonne, there's a big initiative to do this, led in part by Ian Foster, who's sitting back here in the room. And here's a paper that Ian led last summer that kind of capitalizes on the work that we've been doing over the last couple of years around designing an architecture for these kind of labs. And the basic idea here, I see this is, there we go. So we've been building out this laboratory at Argonne. We actually have several labs where we're assembling robotics, building an environment where we can both use VR to plan the layout of these systems and to test out the idea of automating end-to-end scientific processes from some kind of generative model to doing experiments to getting feedback and closing that loop. A particular area that's of interest to some of our team is to use this system to design proteins that can optimize some function, right? So language models have been demonstrated they can design proteins, they can design DNA, they can be used to do sequence analysis. So we built on top of that some work that we did last year for the Gordon Bell Award at SC, this model called GenSLEM, which is a codon-based sequence prediction model, and then built a reinforcement learning engine around that. And the idea here is to take a given protein, in this case, we're using the malate dehydrogenase protein, which is a well-understood enzyme. And our goal here was to do two things. It was to try to optimize the enzyme kinetics of this enzyme, that is, optimize its ability to catalyze the reaction, and at the same time increase the sequence diversity. Okay, so to design a protein that's not like what nature had created, but is able to carry out a function that nature created, but even more efficiently. And so there's, you can see here in the diagram, there's a catalytic region in the middle, and these backbones, these alpha chains that represent the core of the protein, and then various variations. And we were able to do several things with this. One is to create many, many design points, and then synthesize these, and then test them and measure their efficiency. And we got, in some cases, some substantial increase in efficiency. But we also discovered that we could design a protein that was only 1/3 the length of the wild type, but yet would still be able to carry out the reaction. So there's much more to be done in this case, but this is the idea of having a generative AI model, robots to synthesize the protein, test the protein, collect data, feedback, and iterate. In the case of AI for high-performance computing surrogates, right, the basic idea here is you want to take a problem for which you have an existing solution, maybe a physics problem, a climate, biophysical modeling, or something, and you want to collect data by running it on thousands of examples, collect data in some functional sense. So you have some kernel that you're running, you're collecting the input-output relationship, and you build a replacement machine learning model for that kernel. And it could be for anything. We have one of these that we built for drug docking that is completely machine learn replacement for the biophysical model. We have some for climate, for particle physics, and so on. And what's interesting with this is that you can get incredibly large speed up. So here's an example of how you might use this in materials design. So you have a traditional electronic structure calculation, say in this box up here, and you've got a bunch of materials that you want to estimate the properties for, maybe because you're trying to search for something that has some interesting combination of properties. So you're going to run 1,000, maybe 10,000 forward calculations, collect these properties. You're going to then take the input specification for these models. You're going to use some system. Could be a deep neural network, could be some other Bayesian system, could be random forest, could be something, to build a model that carries out the same logical function, but now uses a machine learning method to estimate these properties. Once you have that model, you can then do a large-scale search using this model instead of the original model. And the reason you might want to do that is that the surrogate model often is 1,000 times faster, or maybe 100,000 times faster, or what was indicated here on this slide on the lower right here, 2 billion times faster in some problem cases. So what surrogates give you is an approximate solution, often as good as the system that you originally were replacing, but can be much faster, and of course is the product of data-driven design. And there are many, many domains using this. In drug design, we have a surrogate that we use to replace docking, as I mentioned. We dock about 100,000 molecules, use that as training data, build a surrogate, take that surrogate, and in 1 hour on some small number of nodes on Aurora, we can predict the properties, the binding properties, say, of something like 40 billion molecules. So it's a huge accelerator. And often, you will then take the hit and go back and recompute using the original method just to verify, but in the process, have a huge expansion of the search space. This has been applied to molecular dynamics of soft materials. You can see that the surrogate almost perfectly reproduces the molecular dynamics. In this particular case, this group got a 10,000x speed up for those problems. So these are things that could take an exascale machine and make it effectively a Zettascale machine. And there's many, many areas. One of the key areas here is whether we can get this to work in climate modeling. People have been able to do this for weather prediction and to get enormous speed ups, factor of 1000x speed up on like 7-day weather forecasting. It hasn't yet been demonstrated at large scale climate, but there's many, many problem areas. One of the research goals is to find a way to reduce the cost of building these models, to almost automate these, almost to the point of building it like into the compilation tool chain. So let me talk a little bit now about foundation models for scientific knowledge. So this is this is obviously a super hot topic, a very broad topic now. This term was coined a few years ago at Stanford as a way to talk about this idea of having a single big model that you train with large amounts of generalized data. It's not problem specific. You pre-train that model and then you adapt it for downstream use cases. And so it's a generalization of the way in which things like ChatGPT are trained. And these models can be built on anything, essentially. They can be built, of course, around text or images, but they can be built on code or molecules or whatever. The high energy physics community is building foundation models around high energy physics data, for example. In the case of text or things designed to interface with people, of course, you're going to do additional processes in the adaptation at the right-hand side to improve how humans interact with them. Now, what's of course amazing about these things is that they show emergent properties. As they get big enough and they've seen enough data, they're able to do more complex tasks and show increased skill on complex tasks. And of course, in the broader world, this is driving this huge revolution in AI as we kind of know it right now. And within the DOE labs in the US, there's a number of groups working on building foundation models for discovery. Now, to put things in perspective, GPT-4, right, is probably about 1.5 trillion parameter model. It's a mixture of expert model based on the best information we have, and that makes it about 1% the size of a brain. Your brain has about 100 trillion synapses in it, and if you think of a parameter as roughly equivalent to a synapse, we're talking about current AI systems that have more or less the capacity of about 1% of a brain. Now, what's also quite interesting about this, if you think about this in the context of science, is all of the opportunities. So it's widely believed that we have around, maybe between 200 and 300 million scientific publications in the world. Less than probably 10% of those are fully open at this point, or maybe certainly less than a third are open. But you could think of a sufficiently powerful foundation model able to be trained on millions of papers and extract information from those papers. So this is the idea of knowledge extraction. You could also think of a model that's very powerful to be able to be presented with a paper and to give a very standardized summary and also to be handed something and to distill it down to a very compact representation. This could be in scientific literature, but also could be in things like code or in biological functions and so on. But we also know that these models can synthesize. So they can take data from across many different sources and integrate that knowledge in new ways. This is particularly interesting in concepts like programming, where a model has seen maybe many different programming languages, but it hasn't seen every algorithm in every programming language. And you can ask the model to write an algorithm in a given programming language that's never seen in that programming language. And that's an example of synthesis. Here on the right-hand side is just a list of languages, and I was just asking the model what it was comfortable generating, and it listed things. But what's quite interesting is that these models can also generate, starting level quantum codes, for example, and other things now. They can, of course, generate plans and solve logic puzzles. What I'm going to show you right now are some things that we're experimenting with around using these models to do these three fundamental knowledge tasks. Okay, one is knowledge extraction. So models are trained on, say, trillions of tokens of data, and that knowledge is retained, some form of that knowledge is retained in the model's parameters. You can't directly access that knowledge in the parameters. Your model's going to have billions of weights, and the knowledge is encoded in those weights, but you can prompt the model to ask it questions and have it tell you what it knows about something. So one really important task with these models is ascertaining what a model actually knows about some topic. And that's called knowledge extraction. And I'll show you an example, but we've been building tools for doing this, and this is important about being able to assess whether a model, for example, has certain capabilities that might be dangerous or might be, might be unauthorized to have, and right now it's impossible by inspection to determine that. So knowledge extraction is this idea of what does a model know about something. Knowledge distillation is where you give the model a presentation of something, like a paper, for example, or say thousands of papers or 1 million papers, but you ask the model to summarize all of those things in a very consistent way, extracting knowledge in a parallel fashion, say, for each paper. Like, for example, asking it to summarize a paper and provide the core hypothesis that might be in that paper in a way that allows you to use that information downstream, so you can build workflows with this. The third one is this idea of knowledge synthesis. So demonstrating, working out the workflows and the prompts such that you can force the model to bring knowledge from multiple sources to bear on a given query. And let me just show you some examples, because I think these are kind of interesting. So let me first show you the knowledge extraction case. So here's the experiment that we did. And I can talk about this for hours. I just have one slide on this particular thing here. So we've collected a small database that has information like what's in red here, okay? This is a gene, okay? UB3C, ubiquitin protein ligase E3C. This is a protein that's a human protein that you'll read about it in a second. But we have a list of, say, the 20,000, 25,000 proteins that occur in people, and all we have, say, is the name of the protein and maybe the function that it carries out. Then we apply this prompt that's in green here, right? And you can read, I'll read it here. It says, please tell me using the knowledge you've been trained on, meaning just from the parameters, don't go out and look it up on the web or something like that, what you know about a human gene and gene product. And then this, if you're familiar with Python, this is just a concatenation operator, and then line here is where it's going to insert this, just this string, okay? And in particular, we want to know the information, is this gene well studied, is it less well studied, with some open questions about its function, is it essential for survival, if it's mutated, what happens to the phenotype, and so on. So a standardized set of questions that you're going to ask about every protein in the human, okay? And the models are perfectly cheerful to grind it out. And if you ran this, say, in this particular case here, I ran it on several different models, and I'm not going to talk about the comparison, but this is the output from a local model that is a model able to run on my laptop, very similar to the same output I would get if I ran it on ChatGPT. So what does it say here? It says the gene encodes ubiquitin protein, whatever, it plays a critical role in ubiquitination, which is the process of degrading proteins. So anyway, it's giving, I won't read the whole thing, but it's giving you a report on this gene. This is information coming strictly from the encoded information and the parameters of the model. It's not looking anything up in any external resource. But you can see from the way that I prompted it, is each of these paragraphs is answering a question in the prompt in a very regular way. I ask it about, is it involved in transcriptional regulation? Does it regulate the expression of other genes, for example? Then down at the bottom here, I ask a very special question, right? If you look at the prompt, it says at the very bottom here, it says, if you were starting out as a research oncologist, what might be a hypothesis you could explore related to this protein that would have a significant scientific impact? So I'm asking it systematically to go through every gene and answer that question. So down here at the bottom it says, for a research oncologist considering this, interesting hypothesis could involve investigating the precise mechanism by which this gene interacts with P53, which is another oncogene, and other tumor suppressors or oncogenes, and how these interactions contribute to cancer development and progression. So it's coming up with a hypothesis, an interesting hypothesis, on a specific target. This is kind of amazing because all I'm giving it as the prompt, well, I'm giving it these questions, but the only kernel that I'm giving it is essentially the name of the gene and the name and extracting from its parameters. This means you could do this with many models. Of course, Hugging Face has 400,000 models, probably couldn't do it for all of them, but you could do it for many models and compare now the output to see what kind of underlying data those models were trained on. It'd take a lot of computing to do that, but you could do it. We'll talk about distillation and summarization. Okay, so this is the idea here that we're going to use a large language model to process something and produce a concise summary of it. So it's not like the first case where I gave it only a seed. Here I'm giving it a complete object, like a paper. For example, I'm giving it this paper on the right-hand side. In fact, in this particular experiment, I gave it 45,000 papers. Okay? And I'm asking it to summarize the paper in a very structured fashion. And here's what I'm asking it to do. So first of all, these papers all came from the Semantic Scholar system that's built by the Allen Institute for AI, so we have a good relationship with them, and we have tools for pulling things back and forth, so I get this ID at the top, so I can actually dereference it back in and double check that it did something reasonable. I have it build out the title, I have it the year, summarize the key findings of this paper, then I ask it for the main result, again, a little compact paragraph that I can use elsewhere, then I ask it for any hypotheses that that paper contains. Because what we're trying to do is mine the literature for hypotheses, and you'll see in a minute why we're doing this. So I have it pull out a hypothesis, and it does this for every paper exactly in the same way. Like a very dutiful student that you've given a very boring task, right? And it's quite reliable. Again, this particular extraction was done by a model on my laptop running under LM Studio. It was an open source model. This was a model called Solar, which is a 10 billion parameter model produced in South Korea that has some very nice story around it, but it's a very capable kind of science model. So now we're going to do knowledge synthesis. And I'm going to use, for this one here, I'm going to use ChatGPT-4 with the consensus model. So if you've been tracking ChatGPT-4, they recently allowed you to build custom models in their model app store, okay? And consensus is a model that builds on ChatGPT-4, but has built into it a large reservoir of scientific papers that have been embedded so that it can do queries against those papers, okay? Which is kind of interesting. So here's the prompt. Okay, you might recognize this. I say at the very top of this, I say, please generate an experimental plan to test the following, colon. And then what's pasted in there is actually this hypothesis. Okay? So I'm asking the model to generate an experimental plan to investigate, to test that hypothesis. So consensus, unlike the base ChatGPT-4 model, it knows how to talk to this embedded database it has with papers. So it can actually generate very reliable references. In this particular case, I did not give it an outline of any structure for this plan. So it's coming up with this plan all on its own. Right? So it says, design experimental plan, test hypothesis, stat gene plays a significant role in cancer progression, et cetera, et cetera. It came up with this plan, and it has 4 different phases. So it has a in vitro analysis phase, it has an in vivo analysis phase. So in vitro is like doing something in a petri dish or in a cell culture. Then the in vivo analysis is in live animals, say, like mice or something. Then it has analysis of human cancer data using something like the Cancer Genome Atlas, and then integrative analysis. And what's interesting about this plan is that it includes citations to papers that support the methods in the plan. And you can see kind of where I'm going with this, right? We want to ultimately connect this to the automated laboratory. And in fact, we have some cases where we could take this experimental plan and hand it to another AI that can actually build out the detailed experimental plan, and then another one that could build the robotic instructions. So we're incrementally moving to the point where we could extract hypotheses from papers and build the pipeline to actually experimentally answer those questions. Now, just for fun, I decided to do the same thing. It's a little bit hard to read here, but I'm happy to send the deck to you. The exact same analysis, but now not with ChatGPT-4, but with a Mixtral model. So Mixtral is a model produced by Mistral, which is a company in France building large language models. The Mixtral 8x7b is a 56 billion parameter model. It's a mixture of experts model. At any given time, it uses it uses 2 experts out of the 8. So it takes about 14 gigabytes of memory to run it on. And it was running literally on this laptop right here under LM Studio, which is the user interface there that I'm talking about. And I ask it the same question, and it's a little hard to read, but it says test hypotheses, comes up with the methods, and it starts to do a patient cohort selection, expression analysis, et cetera. So it builds out a plan. It's a little bit different than the ChatGPT-4 plan, but it can do it, and it builds it out quite nicely. So I'm going to stop here in a second. I'm just going to say a few more words about where we're headed with this project that we call the Aurora GPT project, because we're talking with our Recon friends about this a lot, who are our partners in this. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an outline on this. So starting in around 2020, in a class that Ian Foster and I were teaching, we started speculating about the possibility of building trillion parameter models in the generation of machines that we were getting installed at Argonne, and at Oak Ridge, and at Recon, and Livermore, and other places. And we started doing analysis back then. And then last year, around this time, at the Recon ADAC meeting here, we decided to hatch a plan to actually do this. So Aurora GPT, we call it Aurora GPT because it's named after the big machine at Argonne, but ultimately it'll probably be called something else. But we envision this as a series of models, and it's going to be trained on general text code, like what you think of normal models, and of course, scientific domain knowledge from publications and deeper publications than what most models have been trained on, but also scientific knowledge that we can extract from scientific databases, and there's more to be said about that. We envision this project lasting at least the next 3 years, but this current year that we're in, as we're booting it up, it's more or less a text-only model to debug everything, but we'll produce versions of it that are raw models that we can distribute to friends, and instruct models that can follow instructions. And then we'll work towards multimodal, basic multimodal, and then what we call advanced scientific multimodal that knows about a lot of different scientific data types. That's the basic idea. If you're thinking about the cartoon version of it, it looks something like this. So you have text and code in the green here. That's pretty much what existing models out in the world are trained on. Media, Wikipedia, and so forth. What we want to add to that are deeper training on scientific data sets, and not all of these at once, of course. Use the kinds of computers that we have, like Polaris and Aurora at Argonne, Fugaku, Mare Nostrum 5, maybe down there at the bottom. Produce an open science version. It's called open science because it doesn't contain any kind of classified data or anything, and then be able to adapt it to all kinds of downstream applications. And that's what Aurora looks like these days. And just, I'm going to close on this slide right here. Just to make sure that you understand this is not an easy task. This is a table that estimates the training time for different sizes of models. So models here on the left in billions of parameters, number of training tokens. The assumption here is we're running all in FP16 on a machine like Aurora. So Aurora's 60,000 nodes, has about 127,000 tiles. Each GPU has 2 tiles in it. And each tile is about 180 teraflops in HGEM mode, so BFP16. So the whole machine in FP16 is around 23-ish teraflops. And even so, a trillion parameter model, say trained on 20 trillion tokens, which would be kind of in balance by the chinchilla scaling law, is estimated to take, according to this chart, about 136 days on a machine like Aurora, so almost half a year to do that. So we have to probably get something better than the approach indicated by this table. But clearly, for smaller models, we can do some of these, like a 7 billion parameter model. You could train on the whole machine in order of a day, which means you could do a lot of experiments, say, in 7 billion parameters. So with that, I'll stop. I don't know if we have any time for questions, but happy to answer if we do. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.